Welcome to Art History from Prehistory to 1300. This class will cover a range of canonical works, very famous ones from cave paintings through the ancient Greeks and Romans and the Middle Ages, ending with the Gothic cathedrals of Europe and finally the precursors to the Renaissance. This lecture will cover everything that is needed as prior knowledge leading up to the first class on history we will begin with next time. We will cover in this section entitled What is Art History? A range of important topics, vocabulary, and ways in which to frame the field. Now, covered in this lecture, we will be introducing a number of important themes and important things to cover. One is going to be the definition of art to ensure that we know the difference in how early man would have understood what was being produced versus what we find now in museums. Next, we will define the field that seeks to understand this type of work of material culture better, art history. Following that, we will introduce the types of investigation used by art historians in order to understand these works, such as those by the Egyptians we see here. Then we will discuss the context and how important it is to understand the context in which these works were made, which is very different from artists of today. And then we will finally define the different types of media of which art is made of, from painting to sculpture to architecture. Now, before we begin with the definition of art, we need some information associated with what we consider art, which is largely an invention of the Western world. Now, UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, is the primary worldwide organization in charge of preserving and identifying important historical works, buildings, and even cities that need to be preserved. And they identify that over 60% of what we consider art in the World Heritage Sites are going to be in Italy. And there is a reason for that if we also consider the fact that art is 98% religious throughout all of history, from the Nike of Samothrace seen here to a range of works that wouldn't even be considered art by their makers, such as Navajo sand painting, Thai, Chinese, Korean, and Japanese Buddhist statues, pre-Columbian Mayan relief sculptures, or decorative vegetal motifs and arabesque patterns in Islamic mosques. All of these examples, considered art in textbooks today, were originally used for religious purposes and to understand the spiritual world and try to control it in some way. Now, in order to understand what art is, we might begin with the definition in the dictionary, which would state something along the lines of art being a noun, such as the quality, production, expression, or realm of what is more beautiful or of more than ordinary significance. Now, this definition is so broad that we can apply it to a range of objects that would be considered non-art objects to most, such as things that are considered beautiful or more than of ordinary significance could refer to a beautifully crafted piece of furniture, for instance, and we would not generally in the West consider that fine art. For our purposes here, given that this class will only cover art up until the Renaissance, we need to understand how early humans used art and how we are going to define it in this class. Number one, in looking at the pebble on the right here, many might attempt to read in it an anthropomorphized face, such as two eyes, a mouth, and a nose. Now, this is not an example of a work of art in the context we will be discussing. 40,000 years ago, this was actually found in South Africa by early humans in a stream which had worn away parts of this pebble until it looked like a human face. So we seek out things that remind us of ourselves and that look like other things in the world. This is not a work of art, importantly, because the person that found it did not shape it. They did not make it. Hence, representation is a term we need to be aware aware of. That is to state, if we're going to represent something such as a human or an animal in prehistory, we are presenting it again. We are physically altering a substance such as the surface of a cave or sculpting a piece of mammoth bone or ivory to make it look like something else. Hence, this is representation, being presented again. Now, we can turn now to the definition of what art is. Now, although it is very difficult to frame all of the possible iterations of art, we are able to state, as Richard Anderson said, that art is culturally significant meaning, skillfully encoded in an affecting, sensuous medium. And this, of course, is another way of saying that art communicates ideas, whether they be social, religious, political, or otherwise. The ideas that a civilization found were significant at the time. Yet they must be encoded in such a way that we are interested in looking at them. Certainly what is fashionable today would not be appealing to those, say, in college 50 years ago. So you must use the vocabulary and the style of the present to effectively communicate to your audience. Additionally, earlier civilizations really have no concept of art as we understand it, of something whose primary purpose is to be aesthetically appreciated. Everything that was created was for a purpose and a use, usually religious, such as the snake goddess seen here, used to control the sea and animals. Another way to frame this would be art as a reflection of culture, in that art as we see it, whether it be a temple, a statue of a god, or a ruler, is always going to communicate the cultural beliefs, hegemony, and the system that created it. The politics behind it, such as the democratic approach to civilization in Athens, which built the Parthenon, or the polytheistic religion which believed in multiple gods, that also is going to find the statue of Athena within. Now, if we were to ask individuals what they thought art would be, many very often state that it's the expression of the artist, or, as Susan Langer would say, the objectification of feeling. Now, this is a late definition of art, coming along only at the end of the 18th century with the advent of Romanticism, and the modern art movements of the 19th century perpetuated this idea that art is the emotional expression of how an artist sees and experiences the world. This would be entirely foreign to the audience and the patrons that we'll be talking about in this class. As an easy reference, the art world and the history of art can be broken up into three different periods. Prehistory until 1800, and that's when art is going to be understood as the reflection of culture, that being the Egyptian culture, the Romans, the Greeks, the Christians in the Middle Ages, right, the Renaissance, right? All of these are going to be creating these works of art, as we now call them, to serve a particular socio-religious function. Now, with the advent of Romanticism and modern art in the 19th century, we have this idea that art is the expression of the artist. This is going to hold true until the death of modernism and the birth of postmodernism in 1970. At this point, we find that art is going to become the reflection of the artist, a point that will be covered in detail in the second survey. Now, what is art history, specifically, as opposed to the history of art? The distinction seems to be relatively slight, but very important for how we will be approaching the works and the material culture in this class. The history of art, which is the birth of art history, with the first art historian Johann Winckelmann building on the precepts of Giorgio Vasari, is going to view a series of works as chains of causality, that being where we look at works in a particular order that are listed chronologically, and that virtually is all the discipline was responsible for, is stating that in the ancient ancient Greek world, for instance, the Archaic period gave way to the early classical, the high classical, the late classical, and finally the Hellenistic period. Each one of these nude male figures will be part of this developmental chain leading to the next. Thus, we can clearly see an evolution or development throughout human history. Now that, however, does not tell us how these works were originally used, what their original functions and contexts were. So art history, which comes about in the 1960s and 70s, or the new art history, coinciding with new critical theory in all disciplines, such as history, sociology, psychology, anthropology, all of these different types of disciplines are going to now be interested in the broader context of how they were actually used, in the case of art, by their producers and consumers. More specifically, what we want to know, such as with the Egyptian funerary mask of King Tut here on the right, is who paid for it. In this case, of course, an Egyptian pharaoh. That is important because it tells us how we should understand it. Why specifically was it produced? And of course, knowing something about Egyptian culture, you probably know that it was designed to help protect his mummy underneath. This is the innermost mask pressing against the mummy and its wrappings directly behind it. And then finally, how was it used or perceived? And we would, of course, know at the time that he is presented as a pharaoh, the incarnation of the god Horus, ruler of Upper and Lower Egypt, seen as such with the Nemes headdress, the cobra, and the vulture on the top of his brow, and then the false beard, the lapis lazuli and the color blue, the religious and symbolic color of the god Horus. So all of this is going to be important for understanding how it was originally used, not only that it is a New Kingdom work of the ancient Egyptians. Now, each one of these works can be approached in three specific ways by art historians that we will use over the course of this class. The first, when approaching any given work, is to establish exactly what it is in itself. And this is going to be done by way of formal analysis, which is going to be making the visual, verbal, or readable. It's where we're going to be turning visual information and characteristics into language, using words to describe them. Therefore, we assess the physical properties of something. What is it made of? Is it a painting, a sculpture, a work of architecture? How big is it? What do we know about the physical properties of it? The lines, the contours, the colors that are used. Then this gives way to iconography. We will look at each one of these ideas in detail momentarily. Iconography is going to be where we identify the natural subject matter or symbolism of a given work, as we often state. What does it symbolize? And then finally, once we identify that this is a marble relief sculpture of the goddess Nike adjusting her sandals as we see a woman scantily clad with wings on her back, we can then move on to iconology, which is the final stage of interpretation, where we look at cultural context. What is happening at the time when this was made, which helps us understand why it looks the way that it does. As an example, we give you this massive, over life-size statue of a nude man. Now, we would begin in talking about any work, and this one in particular, by assessing the physical properties. We have, of course, a very large marble statue, which has a mature male with a beard and long hair, with his right hand behind his back, leaning in a contrapposto pose on a lion skin and a club. Now, this would be a formal analysis which would assist anyone who is not able to see it in visualizing what this looks like. That does not, however, tell us what exactly it is we're looking at. We would begin in this first stage by pointing out the natural subject matter, that being at any point in time in human history, people would be able to look at this and recognize the forms from experience. That being, we would be able to identify this as a nude male instead of a nude female, for instance. The next phase of interpretation is iconography, or writing with images, right? Or image writing, from the ikono from the Greek image and graphos from the Greek to write. In iconography, we then identify the conventional subject matter or symbolism that would be common to a particular time and place. Therefore, we would have to live at this time and be familiar with their belief system, politics, and religion in order to fully grasp what is happening. In this instance, we are going to be living in ancient Greece in the period in which this was made in the 4th century. We would be a polytheistic society, believing in multiple gods, and of course would understand the entire list of the Greek gods and the myths associated with them. In the case of very large, muscular figures with a lion skin and a club, and especially if we walk around back of this figure, we notice he holds apples, we would easily be able to identify him as Heracles, the Greek term for the Latin Hercules. So in this, we are easily able to, if we lived at the time or know something about the culture, identify this as Hercules, the strongest man who ever lived, who would return to Mount Olympus after accomplishing 12 labors. But that does not tell us why it looks the way that it does. That is to state, there are a myriad of ways that we can show Hercules, from abstract designs to sculpture to painting in various visages, right, and various types of musculature. But he is shown here incredibly hypertrophied or very muscular, as well as incredibly exhausted and or emotionally tapped. And why is that? Because at the time, we have the late classical period being launched with the Peloponnesian War. The faith in mankind's ability to understand the world intellectually and rationally gives way after Athens is defeated by Sparta in the Peloponnesian War to this disenfranchisement with the world, and so an emotional approach takes over. We begin humanizing the gods in this way, showing them feeling the same pain and the same experiences that we would, making them relatable. So this is your intellectual and historical context that allows us, if we understand the period, to explain why it looks the way that it does. And we'll note the same thing is going to be true of other religious figures such as Christ, who is shown in thousands of ways over 2,000 years. Now, context is also very important to consider when discussing art history. Context is going to generally be a mystery to most visitors in museums, those crowding around the Mona Lisa for a photograph and or visiting different museums around the world, because museums are designed to strip a work from its original context and present it in a neutralized fashion, in a blank and otherwise focused environment, which is hushed much like a religious structure. But we must remember that virtually no works throughout history were designed to be seen in this context. Most were presented and were created for a religious context, such as protecting a pharaoh in the afterlife as he's going to battle Apophis in order to keep the massive worm from eating the sun and thus reincarnating again as his father Amun-Ra. A very important religious function we would find these Egyptian tombs to be carried out. Now that is stripped and we are asked to look solely at the works and their aesthetic appreciation in most museums. Again, as we were discussing what is important in considering with works of art, we can never overlook who paid for something. And this is going to point to patronage, or someone who pays for a work of art. And those throughout history are generally going to be rulers, whether they be political or religious, going back to ancient Sumeria and priest kings, or Akkadian and Assyrian rulers, or once again Persian emperors, or Egyptian pharaohs, Roman emperors, right? All of these important people giving way in the Middle Ages to the popes. So who paid for a work is going to be very important in understanding what they want to communicate, such as the first emperor of Rome here, Augustus, wanting to be associated with the gods, hence showing another son of Venus at his feet, Cupid. Now, the final thing we're going to note in considering art in this period is that there are no artists. which this might be difficult to imagine given the craftsmanship and the appreciation we have for many of these cultures, the Greeks and the Romans especially. But all of these individuals are not creating work as we would understand it later on, inspired by creative genius as these lone interpreters of human emotion in the Romantic conception of art. Instead, these are all going to be individuals that generally train under their fathers, who trained under their fathers. They're generally male throughout history, who are going to be very good, skilled craftsmen and work in the employ of very wealthy and powerful men generally in communicating their political and religious messages. So they are merely going to be a tool for these individuals and rulers to communicate what is important to them. So this is the primary difference between what we now understand as an artist in control of the content and style of their works versus an artisan who is going to be a skillful craftsman working for someone else. Now, turning to the definitions that you will need to know over the course of this term, we'll begin with a very important one, that being style. Now, style can be used in many different ways and reference many things. In the case that we will be using it here is going to be visually distinct characteristics that will relate to a particular artist, region, or period. That being, we're looking for characteristics that are similar so that we can then identify them as being from a particular place, being created from a particular period or a particular artist, and thus we can identify them more readily. Just like the one on the left, you will be able to pick out as a period style known as the Amarna style, created in the Amarna period of the New Kingdom of ancient Egypt. It is easy to identify because we have rounded androgynous forms, and now the gods give way to a round sun disk. Now, the period style, as a definition, of course, relates to a particular chronological period. Turning to personal style, we have a group of characteristics that relate to an individual artist, such as Praxiteles, for instance, the Praxitelean style being one that is soft and defined by a sensuous languor. The flesh is going to be much more sensual and corporal in this way. We can only, of course, identify a personal style when we know an artist's name and/or the workshop they came from, though. Turning now to regional style, we have characteristics that are common to a particular geographical area, such as the Cyclades. So we would refer to the Cycladic style, common in the prehistoric Aegean, where we have a series of female figures that are carved in rigid geometric overlapping shapes, such as triangles seen here. To shape these various stylistic characteristics, we are going to now need to define a media and technique. Because all art requires a particular medium, that being the material with which we are going to shape, with an appropriate technique to make it look like something else with the representational methods. That being, a sculpture is going to be a modified three-dimensional form, whereas a painting is going to be modifying colors and lines on a flat surface. Possibly the most famous type of art, if we were to ask someone to define or give an example of art, would be painting. Now, painting is going to be the practice of applying paint, pigment, or color to a particular surface known as a support. So how these are going to be blended and what the vehicle is will determine what type of painting is going to be discussed or represented. For tempera, we're going to have one of the most long-lasting and popular mediums of painting that is used by the ancient Greeks, the Egyptians, and Romans, lasting all the way up until the Renaissance in the 15th century as the dominant medium. Now, tempera is going to be using crushed pigment mixed with egg yolk as a binder, and then mixed with pigment powder and thinned with water. Therefore, if you've ever cracked an egg and let it dry, you will note that the egg yolk dries very quickly, is very hard and tough, and very difficult to scrape off. So it makes an ideal binder throughout history. What tempera allows you to do is make paintings that are quite luminous with a flat, matte surface. The problem, of course, is that with tempera, you cannot mix the colors or pigments after they are applied to the surface. But they are very good for sharp lines and details, though they dry incredibly rapidly. Another variety of painting is encaustic. Encaustic is still used today by modern artists and was popular going back to the ancient world, where we find pigments are going to be dissolved in a binder of molten beeswax. Now, we do not need a vehicle or something to make the paint more fluid or move it around the surface because the wax is sufficiently fluid in and of itself until it dries. This type of painting will be used by the Egyptians and the Greeks, especially to polychrome their statues, whereby they want them to look incredibly naturalistic, so they will paint all of these three-dimensional forms to look like real flesh and blood. Fresco is going to be popular in the modern world, largely because of famous monuments like Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel. Fresco, literally Italian for fresh, is going to be made when pigment is suspended in water, like watercolor, but then applied to a wet lime plaster surface. The vehicle with fresco is water, hence making it fluid, and the binder is lime, hence the lime and lime plaster. There are two varieties of fresco, the first being buon fresco, true fresco, or good fresh in Italian, as it translates again, is applied to damp plaster on the surface, such as seen in the works, paintings and murals in Pompeii and Herculaneum, as seen here. Now, the other variety, common in ancient Egypt, is fresco secco, which is applying this pigment to a dry lime plaster surface. It is very good for delicate details, such as the scales on the fish here, the hair of the cat, and or the feathers of a bird. The downside to fresco secco is you must keep it away from sunlight and moisture or it flakes off. Therefore, Egypt is the perfect place for it, given these are going to be found underground, in deserts, in tombs. Now, sculpture is another medium that is used in the history of art when we wish to make something that is three-dimensional. Now, this is made when you shape or combine hard materials. Most often in cultures, we find this is going to be stone, wood, or metal. Obviously, the most prolific or common type of sculpture that survives is stone. Wood, we find throughout history, rots over time, and metal is going to often be sought after and melted down by various cultures. Now, sculpture is the sum of its profiles and surfaces. Therefore, we must consider all angles to fully appreciate it. Now, there are two main varieties of sculpture. The first is freestanding, known as such because it is meant to be seen in the round, thus freestanding, not attached to anything, such as seen here with the Laocoon, or later on in the Renaissance with Michelangelo's David. The other variety of sculpture is going to be found on coins, such as you have in your pocket, a numismatic collector's love. Now, relief sculpture is going to not be freestanding, but instead be a three-dimensional work that projects from a flat background, or bas relief, as we would call it. There are two varieties of sculpture. The first, seen here, and common with coins, is going to project only slightly from the surface, known as low relief sculpture. This type of sculpture is good for communicating information clearly in a long-lasting format because it does not break off easily. The other variety is high relief sculpture, which projects more than half the circumference from the modeled form, projecting from the background surface. Now, this type of sculpture, which is going to cast deep shadows and come out into our space, is good for communicating incredibly theatrical and dramatic scenes, but, as you see here, is also going to run the risk of being broken off over time. Therefore, it is not in as great an abundance as far as what has survived. Now, the different ways in which you can make either types of sculpture, that being freestanding or relief, are as follows. You can produce them with casting, which is where you substitute one material for another in a substitution process. Generally, you're going to be taking a more impermanent material like clay and replacing it with a more permanent one like bronze. That's what we have with Rodin's Thinker, for instance. We would begin in the most common type of substitution casting in the ancient world, from the Sumerians leading all the way up until the Renaissance, is lost wax casting, otherwise known as bronze hollow casting. Now, bronze hollow casting is going to take a work, replace it with bronze in a thin shell, and then destroy the original work. So you have one attempt to make this sculpture. The process by which a lost wax casting or bronze hollow casting is made begins by making the sculpture out of an impermanent example such as clay or terracotta. So once again, once you have the figure in the design that you would like to see in another material, you then cover it in wax and bury it in the ground upside down. Now, the reason why you do this is to contain the immense heat of the molten metal underground and dissipate that heat as it melts the wax, thus leaving a thin metal shell around the clay. Then you pour in the desired permanent material. In the ancient world, the preference was for bronze, into these openings that melt the wax. Once it dries, you pull the sculpture out of the ground, buff off and scrape off the excess materials, and then polish down the material to the final desired marble bronze effect. The other variety of sculpture, especially common in freestanding examples, is carving. Now, carving most often uses stone or wood, and this is where you remove unwanted materials from the sculpture in a subtractive process. So you must keep in mind what you want the final product to look like the entire time you are sculpting it. Now, this is the most challenging, it has been said, by sculptors such as Michelangelo, because the sculptural method leaves little room for error. Once you carve something off, you cannot replace it. So the sculptor must visualize the entire time they're working where the forms are all the way around the sculpture in a three-dimensional fashion. Now, there are different types of stone that in different cultures are appreciated for their characteristics. In Europe, taking their cue from the ancient Greeks and Romans, we find that marble will be appreciated because it is a soft and workable stone that can be cut with a chisel and polished to a shiny, white, gleaming surface. Other cultures, such as the Egyptians or the Chinese, will appreciate other stones for different reasons. The ancient Egyptians will appreciate a very hard, dense stone that cannot be easily modeled or molded, such as diorite or gneiss. This very hard stone is appreciated simply because it is permanent, that it is hard, and thus you get a form carved of it that looks equally permanent. Now, the Chinese are going to appreciate jade, the green, once again, material that is hard and brittle, that you cannot carve for it will shatter. You can only mold it and or change its shape by grinding it down or filing. Now, finally, we turn to architecture, the third media in the Western world, which is both the process and product of planning, designing, and building a structure. Now, the very earliest types of architecture will begin in the Neolithic period, covered here shortly. And this is known as masonry, where, in the simplest building technique, we merely take stones and pile them on top of other stones. There is no mortar or anything to set or to attach the stones together. Instead, gravity is going to be what holds them up, such as the great stone wall at Jericho here. Now, later on, we will begin dressing stones, which is where you cut or shape them, generally into consistent shapes, to be piled one on top of another in a more careful interlocking fashion. The dominant form of construction throughout history is certainly the post and lintel form of construction. In this system, seen in Stonehenge very famously, we will have two vertical supports and or posts that support a horizontal beam or lintel. Thus, if we extend this across, again, a horizontal axis or grid, you have a structure which can then be covered with a roof. Thus, you have an interior space. Now, following the post and lintel system, the next phase in evolution in architecture comes with the Romans and the round or Roman arch, as it becomes known, because it's popularized and spread everywhere by the Roman civilization. In this arch, we have a semicircular arch that is supported by columns or piers. Now, with the round or Roman arch, we are able to use much less building material, such as we don't need a wall here, to support much more weight. Therefore, Romans can use them to ship or move water across vast distances to their cities all over Western Europe. In arches, we have a series of them relating to an arcade. And with each pier, we're going to have them supported by a keystone that distributes the weight right in the center, the apex of this arch, down each side equally. That is the key to Roman arches. Following the invention of Roman arches, the Romans also invent something that will lead to modern architecture and building material, and that is concrete. So concrete is a composite construction material composed of an aggregate that is generally going to be ground stone or cementa mixed with lime mortar and volcanic sand called pozzolana in Italian. Now, when mixed together, this very strong concrete would set even underwater, thus allowing the Romans to build massive ports and harbors throughout the ancient world, dominating it. Finally, if we add concrete to a dome, we have the pinnacle of architecture throughout the Middle Ages. Here in the Pantheon, we have a hemispherical dome, but there are also semi-hemispherical and pointed examples of domes. Now, the dome is so beloved in the ancient world and into the Middle Ages that most cultures associate it with the heavens. Therefore, if we see a dome in Islamic society or culture, we see one for the ancient Romans. If we see them in Christian churches or Buddhist temples, they all represent the dome of the heavens. Now, we must ask, which of these media actually survives the longest, and how much of it actually survives? Well, not surprisingly, if we think of what survives the ravages of time and the erosive quality of weather and the wars of man, we find that wooden sculpture is generally going to rot away, so we don't have much of that. We do have a great abundance of stone sculpture left standing because it cannot be repurposed like metal for the use in weapons and or tools. So painting, by and far, survives in the least quantity. That's why we did not have access to ancient painting until 1738 and 48 with the excavation of Herculaneum and Pompeii, respectively. Now then we are able to see what ancient painting looked like. But much of history, we are going to find that painting and most sculpture is lost. So we will look at quite a bit of architecture in this class and what has survived of the other two media. Next time, we will continue on with the earliest remnants of human civilization in the prehistoric period, starting with the Paleolithic Age or the Old Stone Age.